one of my early beliefs was that if it's allowing for more experimentation and more innovation, then that's probably good. Like if we can create coordination mechanisms that produce innovation at a faster pace, then that seems like a positive thing. But at the same time, it seems like global coordination mechanisms and global consensus also prevent innovation because that's sort of a natural monopoly, right? Like anything with network effect is a natural monopoly.
Hey everyone, this is Sina with another episode of Into the Bytecode. My guest today is Stephane Gosselin. Stephane was previously the co-founder of Flashbots and is now beginning work on a new project called OneBalance. I've known Stephane for many years, and it was nice to go deep together in this conversation. So we start by talking about the state of the ecosystem today as it comes to the transaction supply chain, or the transaction supply network. We talk about how a new model for organizing the interactions between accounts and applications is possible, now that we live in a world where block space is abundant and UX is the bottleneck. And we talk about how OneBalance is going after this problem with the credible account and the credible commitment machine, as Stephane explains it. Towards the end of the conversation, we also get into more philosophical territories about how each of us relates to what we're working on and what our deeper motivations are. I do want to say that this podcast is for informational purposes only. It's not financial advice or recommendation to buy or sell securities, and the host and guests may hold positions in the projects discussed. And with that, I'll leave you to it. Into the Bytecode is sponsored by Optimism. The Optimism Collective is building the open source modular software project known as the OP Stack, which allows developers to run layer 2 blockchains, while also addressing key governance and economic challenges in the wider ecosystem. Optimism is also leading decentralized grants experiments, like retroactive public goods funding, which recently granted 10 million OP to projects across developer tooling, infrastructure, and education. More recently, they had a major milestone by adding Coinbase's blockchain Base to also be governed by Optimism governance, and also contribute a portion of their sequencer revenues back to the collective. I've known the Optimism team for many years and know that they're dedicated to both scaling Ethereum and extending its ability to build better economic structures. So if you're interested in learning more, whether you want to build something new or you want to apply for grant funding, then I encourage you to check out Optimism at optimism.io. I know you've been in and around this ecosystem thinking about these problems for a really long time. So I'm curious, before we get into OneBalance and what, your solution to the sets of problems that we're dealing with looks like, how would you characterize, the shape of the ecosystem today when it comes to this transaction supply chain? I've heard you describe it as transaction supply network, the fact that we're bifurcated across all of these layer 2s and chains with different wallets, different balances on each of them. How would you describe what's happening, and why is it that you personally feel compelled to go work on this problem?
I feel like the more I talk about it, not necessarily the more clarity I get. At the end of the day, like for me, there's this story of exploration that I've been on. There's kind of like this initial question that I've asked myself when I entered the crypto space, and I feel like that question has like driven a lot of my exploration. And every project that I've done since then has sort of been around trying to come up with answers to this question. So the question is sort of twofold. Like one, it seems like this technology gets us to experiment with coordination mechanisms in a way that very few other technologies have sort of allowed us to. Like if we take this perspective on just life, which is it's often just groups of humans trying to figure out how to be humans with other groups of humans, and they build up all of these complex things to sort of make sense of the shared reality that they're in, and those things can be just like social norms or they can be, political beliefs, or they could be any sort of characteristics that could say, hey, I'm a member of this group versus I'm a member of this group. And a lot of crypto to me has been about sort of exploring these different mechanisms for coordinating people based off of whatever beliefs that they may hold. The question that I posed myself was, is this something that's fundamentally good? Like, is coordinating a lot of humans towards stuff a good thing? And how can it remain good? Um, I think one of my early beliefs was that if it's allowing for more experimentation and more innovation, then that's probably good. Like if we can create coordination mechanisms that produce innovation at a faster pace, then that seems like a positive thing. But at the same time, it seems like global coordination mechanisms and global consensus also prevent innovation because that's sort of a natural monopoly, right? Like anything with network effect is a natural monopoly. The the um, the impact of monopolies is to censor. So when I talk about censorship here, I don't mean like, oh, getting a transaction on chain. I talk about like expression of divergent beliefs, right? If you have a global consensus over anything, like these are a set of rules that apply to everyone. And if there's so much economic weight to a certain set of rules, it prevents you from being able to have a divergent set of rules, right? And crypto sort of is an embodiment of this. And because there was sort of like the theory of like, oh, well, if you disagree, you can fork, right? And so it's sort of meant to be a mechanism that allows for freely diverging from a certain set of beliefs. But practically, when's the last time we've seen like a meaningful fork, right? The network effects actually prevent forks from taking place. And so I've had this question that I've been exploring, which is like, are global consensus mechanisms a force for good? uh, or do they actually limit the freedom
Do
of
they entrench existing structures and make it even harder to kind of opt out or to experiment with other viewpoints?
exactly? Um, and that's my existential question
Huh.
about crypto. That's the one that I've been asking myself for years and years, and I feel like everything that done has been sort of explorations of this. Um, so you sort of mentioned the transaction supply chain and the transaction supply network. Um, I the perspective that I come into this space with is one of trying to map things as like an information processing system. So like all the individuals that care about crypto are kind of like nodes in the graph, and they're all sharing information with other nodes by talking to them or by running software that talks to other nodes in the graph or whatever. Um, and the transaction supply chain is just like, like a graph of nodes that are processing information, which is like a bunch of users want to get transactions included on chain, and these steps along the supply chain are doing something to try to like fulfill the desires of getting something included on chain while still optimizing for their local thing. And so maybe they're reducing the information or they're augmenting it in some way to be able to achieve a certain outcome. And it's getting more and more complex in the way that these things are taking place. And what we're seeing is sort of emergent um, centers of power in these systems. And so if we say like, okay, these are all kind of like just games being played amongst each other, like we're seeing some emergent dominant players in these games that are capturing power law distributed returns to the capital, returns to power, returns to whatever. Um, and so the question being asked is this global consensus game that we've designed with the emergent properties of certain locus of power um, really a good one, or is it one that should be challenged. And so these are, maybe the questions I've asked myself through this MEV journey, right? Like, what is MEV? It's a lot of a study over power, over global consensus, um, and a lot of the solution space or questions that have been asked by people around it, I think, are sort of looking at um, everything that's around the global consensus, and not necessarily at the idea that perhaps the global consensus is like the thing that's
The
creating
problem in the first place.
it. Yeah. So, anyways, that's been my field of exploration, my journey, and to me, OneBalance is sort of um, a new field of inquiry that says, like, what if we take as the extreme the idea that global consensus isn't the end all be all? Is there a way to enable people to develop their own local consensus? Is there a way to enable individuals to um, transact or communicate or do information processing or train AI models with other individuals without having to talk to the big machine? um, and is this perhaps like a different type of coordination model that may lead to outcomes that are less accumulative towards few entities?
Hmm.
So that's
So talking about accounts is like one lens on this problem, but said another way, you're kind of reimagining the topology of this network in the first place. Like the fact that we have a single blockchain in the middle, like whether it's like Bitcoin or Ethereum or anything else. And that's like the thing, we're all on one peer-to-peer network. We're all, communicating, coordinating with each other through this one blockchain. That's the model that you're questioning, and you're basically saying, what if there's like, smaller disjoint network, maybe overlapping in different ways, and they somehow leverage these kind of central blockchains for maybe coordinating between themselves, but each of them is like a pocket of local coordination in its own right.
Yeah, exactly. Um, and like, I don't want to claim to be the first one to think this way. Like a lot of this stuff is very similar to Cosmos sort of ideology. The Noma folks have done a lot of exploration in this sector as well. I think it is more divergent from the typical sort of Bitcoin or Ethereum point of view with the whole world computer stuff and like single network stuff. But I think it's definitely like a field of exploration that others have delved into as well. But the way that you characterize it, I think, is exactly right. Like, I sort of think of, if we, I've come to the idea that the idea of scarce block space is sort of like a made up concept. Like, it's only scarce because we're getting everyone to stop at the same time to like validate a single transaction, right? And there's not really a good reason why we do that. Not every transaction needs to be have attestations from the global base layer settlement. And so if you take the other extreme to say, like, well, what's the maximum amount of choice that an individual node in the network can have over who gets to test their transaction? Well, you get into this, like, there should be the two parties to a transaction, and maybe there's three parties to a transaction, maybe there's four. Like, these are the only ones that need to have to be party to the transaction. And then what you need is a way for these parties to be able to make commitments to each other. And then based off of those commitments, then you can solve, the coordination problem, which is mutual trust over contract enforcement. And so how do you provide individuals with the ability to make contracts with other individuals without introducing this all-seeing eye of Sauron that like monitors everything, right? Um, that's been kind of the question that I've been asking myself, and that's led me down to the how do you empower accounts to be able to do a little bit more than they're currently able to do.
So can you take me down the intellectual journey of discovery? Because hearing you say what you just said, like brings up thoughts of all sorts of scaling solutions we've talked about in the past, right? Like, let's say even payment channels or something like that is two users caring about their own state and using the global, using the eye of Sauron to keep both of them honest in the case things go wrong. But I'm sure there's a lot more to the story and a reason why you've kind of honed in on the account as the central organizing unit of this new model. Like, what are yeah, can you take me through how to think about this? How did you arrive at this point?
I'm not sure. I think I probably just like blindly stumbled my way there. Like there isn't necessarily this direct line of reasoning. Um, but it's been funny to hear like talking to people that have been in the space for a long time. Like this is just recycling old concepts, but maybe presenting them in like a new way. And it's funny because you know the trope, right? Like there's being early is the same as being wrong, right? Like the question is like what's the right time for a concept to sort of to emerge, right? In the same way that like calculus was discovered in two different places at the same time, like ideas kind of just have a way to like manifest themselves into reality when the time is right, and it's has a lot less to do with the individuals than to do with like just the complex global consciousness that is humanity at producing things. And so, yeah, like, is this very different than state channels or like UTXOs um, or HTLCs, right? If you have the ability of individuals to create lockups that like are believable by other individuals, then it recycles a lot of these different concepts, and perhaps that's sort of what I'm exploring is like what's different about my conceptualization versus the ones that have come previously. Is there something about like the moment that is now that it makes it more welcoming for it than it has in the past. Um, I think one how I landed here um, was looking at like, okay, let's say block space is not scarce, then where what's that sort of end result?
and
And
and and block space is not scarce because you can just get to consensus on this ordering with like a subset of the nodes who care about the state, right? So you just kind of put things into a roll up or into some other structure, and block space there is not scarce anymore. So we're currently entering this world where it's no longer the bottleneck.
exactly, yeah. And rollups is a great example, right? You have a sequencer that's you have to convince to like put your transaction in. If you convince it, it's able to pack a lot of different transactions in a way that the global consensus isn't able to. And so um, I think the model that people have tried to do is like, okay, just like take Ethereum and then put it inside of a rollup, and you get some benefits. Yeah, you get like compressed proof, and you can do like proof aggregation, these kinds of things. Um, but you still have the synchronous environment where all the accounts that are on this rollup need to stop and validate that another account has like done its thing. And so you still have limits to its sharding, and then people will go like league three, league four, or whatever. It seems to me like um, the world that then you end up in is like you still have like an individual user, and maybe we can dive back into like a little bit the metaphysics, because I don't know, I always sort of land back to this. Is I'm an individual user and I have like my state now that's kind of like spread across all of these like environments, right? And like, why is it spread in all these environments? Well, there's different groups of people that care about each of those environments. So I sort of think of blockchains or like stateful blockchains as just like association sets of people, right? Like, so there's like the association set of like Ethereum L1 validators, and then like I trust them with some of my state. And then there's like the association sets of like the people who believe in Blast, right? And then I trust them with some of my state. And then there's the association set of of base, and I trust them with some of my state. Um, but realistically, like it shouldn't be that like that association set is the only one that's able to fulfill whatever I'm trying to achieve, right? Like I should be able to say like, oh, I will go to the blast association set to do things that like matter to me, and to the blast people. And like I can go to base and do things that matter to the base people. But I should be able to come back towards like my own ability to do whatever
Yeah.
I want.
It's like unnecessarily privileging that local zone. It's like giving them more kind of power, more like switching costs out of them than is warranted. If you were only just looking to get some compute or like some specific thing you were looking for in that association set.
Exactly. Right. Like the stickiness, the friction of going in and out
Yeah.
is higher than it would, I would prefer it to be, or like an individual would prefer it to be. And it sort of feels like the end result is, and I've had more and more conversations around this, every account essentially being its own roll up, right? And then every asset being its own roll up, every storage provider being its own roll up. And these are all just association sets or entities that are coming to some set of rules around what they're trying to offer. And then every interaction becomes like cross roll up interactions. Um, and that seemed to me like a state of the world that one is incredibly scalable, but then two also is much more protective of the rights of individuals to associate with the sets of rules that they want to associate with, as opposed to being sort of stuck within one environment. And so, trying to enable that led me to the idea that like it seems like accounts having more control over their own state, and being able to delegate usage of that state across all of these different execution environments is sort of a missing piece to this puzzle. Um, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that we've been thinking about this technology in terms of like how user centric and like sovereign we each are. And we are in a sense because we have these private keys and like, there's no single central party that has control over our state. But on the other hand, we are being ultimately ruled by this collective rule set that we've like opted into and we can't really opt out of. Like there's always the opportunity to exit, but like practically speaking, it's not going to happen. So yeah, it's this idea of flipping the world and like rather than the user going to the applications, like rather than us going to the code, like the code comes to us in a way.
Exactly. Bring the chain to the account rather than the account to the chain. And
Yeah.
that's like it's a really strange sort of shift
Yeah.
in mindset. And it sounds like really abstract. Like you tell someone this
Yeah.
and
I feel like I'm
like,
like on a trip right now.
yeah.
I don't know what's going on.
Yeah, but somehow there's like some inner truth in there that just feels right, and that's enough to be like a guiding light to experiment with.
Okay, so what the hell does it mean in practice?
Yeah, yeah.
What does this mean?
Let's get to the practical. Um, so what I'm pushing for is the concept of credible accounts. And so credible accounts are just accounts that are able to make credible commitments to other accounts without relying on global consensus to enforce those commitments. And we published this blog post introducing OneBalance. You can be reached at onebalance.io, and we present the concept of a credible account. We say that we can express sort of these commitments as resource locks. So an account is aggregating state across all these different chains, and a credible commitment is just to say like this state is locked, conditional on something else happening, right? One thing that these blockchains have been really good at doing is to say segments of state can only be controlled by a certain key. And there are all these global ledgers that like allow you to do this. And then smart contracts say, okay, well, you can like have like more complex programmable stuff, but if those smart contracts are run on the global consensus, then it's kind of like limited. But if you're able to say issue locks or escrows over user state directly at the account level, then so long as there's another account that's like listening for that state lock, and can take some action based off of it, and they can trust that state lock, then you sort of have sort of a direct relationship between two parties. Um, I think like a simple way to think about this is like very early on, 0x kind of came around with this, like, a similar idea, right? Like it's a RFQ, it's a limit order. You say, oh, if you're able to say credibly that the account is going to lock up 10 USDC for like ETH, and someone else can come and like use that and bring it to the chain and then execute it. That's because the account has made a credible commitment over how its like state can be delegated to someone else. And the question that I asked myself was like, how do you bring this to a cross-chain setting? What are the hard problems that sort of emerge? And the biggest one is the validation logic. So if you're just using a single execution environment with sort of synchronous execution, you can rely on the fact that the transaction will revert if the user transfers their funds, right? So the user is not able to double spend. But if you're in an asynchronous environment, the user is able to submit a request, and
So
then
maybe to make sure I follow with the simple case. So when we're on one chain and it's synchronous atomic, like let's say in the case of 0x, I as a user issue this resource lock that says, what am I actually sharing? And then if I moved a USDC that was going to be a part of that trade before a solver goes and submits it to the chain, then that second transaction reverts. And so the chain is kind of maintaining all of my state in one place.
yeah, so that trade will be like, okay, I have 10 USDC in my account, and I'm
Yeah.
signing this message that like if someone gives me 0.5 ETH, then they will get the 10 USDC,
Yeah.
right? But that's just sitting in my EOA, right? And so I could send that message out, and then I can transfer my 10 USDC to like a different account, right? While that message is out. And so let's say that the message is like already being sent by a market maker to like the transaction pool pending inclusion. Well, the market maker like still believes I have that amount in my account, but they can be front run by me like withdrawing from my account. And then when that transaction lands on chain, well, it reverts because there's a check that says like make sure that Stephane's account still has 10 USDC. Um, but if the fulfillment chain is different than the origin chain, you're not able to have that synchronous call to the account to figure out if it has the state still. And so I can front run whatever on one chain and then withdraw, such that I get credited on the other chain, but then the market maker is losing money. So fundamentally, it's like, how do basically the reason why 0x works is because it uses the global consensus to be able to like enforce this thing and like have a revert happen if it's not fulfilled correctly. And I'm like, okay, well, let's take that property that the global consensus offers and just put it into the account directly. And now it doesn't really matter where you're executing against, like which chain. You sort of solve the problem that you're not able to make synchronous calls in an asynchronous environment by saying that actually the validation exists only at the account layer. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so that's the difference in the nitty gritty of the construction. Um, we present in our article 4 different architectures to
Yeah.
sort of achieving this, and all of them have sort of trade-offs. I don't talk so much about the notion of like global consensus versus local consensus because that's kind of like I don't know, it's like an overlay philosophy over all of this. But you can implement credible accounts, using just like 2 global consensus blockchains, right? Like if you want to be able to transact between Ethereum and Solana, like this stuff still helps you because it allows you to do this sort of atomicity across the 2 chains, without having to define the semantics of the execution for each of those chains.
Right. Like you have this abstraction that can speak across both chains without you needing to hook them up directly.
Yeah.
So if with the scenario we were talking about, if we take the kind of adversarial mindset in this open internet, it seems to me like the account would want to potentially fool the solvers into thinking that you can go and fulfill this order, this intent, but I'm going to double spend it over here, and I'm going to win. So and given that the consensus around the account is happening locally, how does the rest of the network know that they can trust it? So how do you think about that?
Yeah. So there's multiple different approaches to resolving that problem, but you're exactly right. That's the core problem to solve. We introduced a concept of a credible commitment machine, which, I mean, we don't introduce it. This is like, Nick Szabo stuff, right? But the idea is that you can run a credible commitment machine directly at the account layer, and that credible commitment machine doesn't need to be like a global consensus blockchain. So a great example there is just a trusted execution environment, right? So like an SGX. So it's a hardware machine that is able to make commitments over the software that it runs, and in theory is tamper proof. And so even if I have access to this machine, I cannot modify what are the outcomes of the software that it runs by any means that I try to. And so anyone else, call it a solver, that is relying on the outputs of this machine can rely on the fact that the commitments that it makes are correct. So this concept of a secure computer that's able to make these commitments exists in other architectures than a global consensus blockchain. So yeah, a TEE is like a really good example because it doesn't require a third party to run it, which I think is interesting. But you can also achieve
because
this
it allows it to kind of like reduce to its like most simplest unit, which is just there being one of this computer which is keeping the state.
Correct. So there's one of these computers that's securing the resource lock, right? In this case, so it's keeping track of all the commitments that my account has made, and it's ensuring that there's no conflict between them. So if I have a pending resource lock over my 10 USDC, it will not co-sign a different transaction that spends something else. It will only allow me to sign over a nonce once. That's like another way to like describe it. So yeah, these machines are quite powerful as a concept. Now, there's a bunch of like reasons why they're like difficult to work with, and so there's other ways that you can achieve the same thing, right? There's not really any difference between saying, okay, this is a T, like a piece of hardware that's providing these guarantees, to say like, okay, there's this like third party that's like neutral into this and is enforcing the same guarantees. So, you and me could trust Vitalik to like run his own little computer, and because Vitalik cannot be corrupted, he's like a trusted source of co-signing over our commitments. And so that's great, right? But like maybe we don't like the fact that it's just like Vitalik. Maybe we want like Vitalik, Dankrad, and Justin Drake to each have like 1/3 shard of the key and have to come to consensus over the commitments that I make for you. The important part here is that it's not like what is the design of that other thing. The important part is that we both agree to trust it. And so long as we both agree to trust it, then it's a valid, credible commitment machine. Because, now I believe that you're not able to corrupt it, and you believe that I'm not able to corrupt it. Therefore, we will accept it as sort of the mediator of our contracts.
Into the Bytecode is sponsored by Privy. One of the biggest problems we're grappling with as builders working on crypto-enabled applications is how to make the right trade-offs between user experience on the one hand and security and privacy on the other hand. How do we promote self-custody and ownership while letting the application shine rather than the crypto behind it? So Privy plays an important role here. They provide simple onboarding so anyone can connect to your app easily by allowing them to sign in with an existing wallet or by making it easy for you to provision a new self-custodial wallet for them, linking to social logins like Google, Twitter, or Discord. I personally have faith in Privy because of the team. Henry Stern, who's one of the co-founders, was previously on an episode of this podcast, so you can listen to that conversation for more of a deep dive. And he and his partner, Asta Lee, have been thinking about data privacy and security for a long, long time. And you can see this in the level of thought they're putting into the product. So if you're working on a new product and thinking about how to reach a wider group of users without compromising on either user experience or privacy and security, then I encourage you to check out Privy at privy.io. So the core parties that we're getting to trust to believe in the security and the trustfulness of this credible commitment machine are, it's basically the solvers, right? Is there anyone else who's like primary in this interaction?
So, yeah, so there's the abstract concept that, any account can talk to any account and make agreements with them. I think practically speaking, like what does this mean? It means that like in systems like 4337 or like RFQs or Uniswap X or intent bridges like across, like all these things are just saying the user wants some counterparty to do an action on their behalf on chain. And like we can call that counterparty a solver. But the user doesn't interact with the chain directly. They don't like sign a transaction. They sign a permission for a counterparty to like execute something on chain for them. And so this drives towards like a vision of the future where the users don't interact with the chain directly. They just issue permissions for third-party solvers to go and interact on their behalf. And so it's the same abstract idea that's being implemented in all of these different things to try to provide a better user experience. We're just saying, okay, there's like a more secure way to go about it, which is users making commitments to solvers, and then those solvers being able to manage the risk of execution using those commitments.
So I'm just trying to like put myself into this world and imagine what it would be like. So in some ways, like when we were talking about, Vitalik, Donkrad, and Justin managing, that state or each doing 1/3 attestation, that problem of getting two mutually distrusting parties to trust the validity of a transaction is the problem that blockchains were originally solving, right? Through global consensus. So what is it that allows us to solve the same problem without going for global consensus and, as secured by proof of work or proof of stake? Like why is this problem easier to solve now? Are we relying on the blockchain in some way, or do you think there's something about it being account centric that means that now the network can trust the resource lock, management of an account with just less on the line? They can kind of trust that the TEE is sufficient for them to kind of work with that account.
So I think it has different use cases. And I'd love to explore this with you a little bit more because I don't know that I have fully fledged mental models around this. But I see it as like global consensus is great for some things, like keeping track of balances of like an asset, right? And so we can rely on the security that the global consensus is offering to say this asset doesn't like fundamentally have like an infinitely like printable units, right? But the specific contract between us two around like exchanging an asset for another, that doesn't require like global consensus security, right? In a similar way that like in traditional finance, not everyone goes and settles their like trade with the DTCC, right? One of our first encounter was looking at security tokens, like back in 2018 or something, right?
This makes us
And
look so lame in
and
retrospect.
yeah, well, I don't know, real world assets, they're sort of
True, they're
vanished.
back.
So actually, this, remember the standard? Is it
You
1400?
contributed to it.
Yeah. That was one of my early like standards contribution.
Hmm.
It's still being used. Like I was talking to the BlackRock team the other day, and I think they're using it for their Biddle token, which to me is crazy. And anyways, a funny sidebar, but in traditional finance, there's T+3 settlement, like exactly for this reason, right? Like you could call that a state channel, right? Where like the broker is like aggregating a bunch of different trades and then internalizing them against each other, and then only settling back into the global state of the DTCC at a certain interval, and that's how the system scales, right? Is to say like, oh yeah, you have the final registry, the final settlement that happens, and it's this globally trusted thing that's secured. Um, but for practical purposes of everyday transacting, you don't need to interact with that thing. You can have eventual settlement into it, and so it's just borrowing that exact same concept here. So there's some things that global consensus is great for, but it doesn't need to secure everything.
That makes sense. So I imagine there will be like rather than thinking of the accounts credible commitment machine as this, fixed thing, I imagine depending on the sensitivity of the, how much value they're looking to transact or to kind of have on escrow with these solvers, that counterparty would be looking for different levels of security in what they have there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Exactly. So, and this will sort of be self-regulating in some way just by like the amount of liquidity that's available, right? Like
Right.
if you want to transact $50 million, like I don't think you'll use a credible account for this, right? Like I think you'll probably do that directly on the L1, because your like requirements for security are much different. Like there's not going to be a counterparty solver that's going to be willing to provide the liquidity for you to be able to make like a trade of that size. Um, I don't know. Maybe there is. There's a lot of value that gets traded OTC. And if you look at like what is OTC, and OTC is like trade is
It's
essentially just,
basically the same thing.
yeah. It's basically the same thing, except it's using like legal contracts, right, to be able to do this,
Right.
as opposed to like some kind of like enforceable credible commitment machine. It's a credible commitment machine of the U.S. government that's like securing the trade, right?
Yeah. So, okay, now kind of imagining again that I'm living in this world. So, um I have my EOA, I have my private key that's securing an Ethereum account, and that is what I use to kind of interface with this OneBalance credible commitment machine. And this is basically this state machine, this virtual machine that a that is aware of the state that is associated with me on all these different blockchains and consensus zones, and has some authority to basically lock those states and to release them. And then basically there's a there's some sort of a peer-to-peer layer. There's a client, and there's basically solvers that are listening to uh, that are like interfacing with my OneBalance credible commitment machine. And that's where they kind of put in requests to lock the states, to revoke, to receive the funds somewhere or other. um, and so in a way, the flow, the usage flow goes, I potentially sign something with my private key. This goes into the OneBalance machine, kind of manages the state locks, and that's what interfaces with the solver network and with the chain. So I no longer like touch the chain directly. Is that like, would you edit any part of what I described there?
No, I thought that was wonderfully said. And let me just, I think I can share my screen on this thing. I don't know if it'll show up for the
Yeah,
audience,
let's see.
but um, but yeah, you basically perfectly described the credible stack, Um,
Mm.
we published this thing called the cake framework, and it sort of introduces this idea that like you want solvers in the middle of the transactions, and then the credible stack is saying like, okay, well, in front of the solvers there's this credible commitment machine that sort of sits there. And so yeah, from like a user perspective, they're still interacting with applications, they still have their wallets or wallets as a service. From a developer, like a DevX perspective, like they're still interfacing with the same SDKs, right? We're working with Wallet Connect, Web3.js, VM, Ethers.js. The only thing that changes is like increased capabilities at the JSON RPC level. So these are additional methods that are being standardized and developed now that we're servicing these capabilities under. And then behind it sits this credible commitment machine that manages the state, as you said. So it aggregates the state across all the different chains, and then it issues locks over that state. Those locks are communicated with solvers. Solvers take those and they fulfill them on chain, and they provide a proof through some kind of oracle that they fulfilled it. And the credible commitment machine says, "Okay, yeah, great. That state transition has been fulfilled. Here, you're being credited with this value. You can now go withdraw it on whichever chain that you want." And then the user can have like the new state that's reflected inside of this virtualized environment. And then obviously all of this complexity of stuff needs to be surfaced back up to the wallets and the apps in the way that they're like able to make sense of. Therefore, data providers play sort of a key role as a part of this as well.
Mm. Makes sense. So this in some ways is orthogonal to 4337 and all the stuff that's happening with smart accounts, key store rollups, like all that stuff, because there we're still talking about commitments on one kind of consensus domain, right? And this is kind of what we really get by moving to this world is that we get one interface for the user across everything that they're engaging with.
Exactly. And I don't think this is like a replacement for 4337. Like I'm actively engaging with them and looking to see how it plugs into each other better. The way that I see it right now, though, it's designed for being sort of accounts on single chains rather than accounts that are able to do like multi-chain communication. And so, we solvers can be paymasters or they can be bundlers in like the 4337 context, and they can bring these user ops to the chain. A resource lock can be wrapped inside of a user op and communicated to solvers using that approach. These are sort of semantical differences in like the types of messages that are being passed around, and how we name the role of the person that like makes the transaction to the chain. But ultimately, like the important part here is that the resource lock is a commitment that can be made from an account about a state on any chain, not just the state that sits within a particular 4337 contract on a particular chain.
Makes sense. And I guess one thing that I feel like is always worth kind of double clicking on with accounts logic is I think we've talked about security and privacy, I think, are two things. And so I guess the security is really the security of the credible commitment machine. And because that's the level of collateral and liquidity that will be managed by the system will be commensurate to its security. And then privacy, I feel like this is almost a level up on top of what we have today, because all of the state is managed by a system, another system, and that can kind of decide what parts of it reveals to who, fundamentally speaking.
Yeah. Um, this is another concept I'm still trying to wrap my head around, and we can talk about just like the first principles aspect to it, but I would love to explore with you like one level deeper, which is still challenging me in like its impact. And this all relates back to like the global consensus thing, and the Eye of Sauron. So um, in a state
Is
channel
that
where
what you called it? OneBalance, by the way? Is that because the Eye of Sauron and the One Ring, like those are both references to the same lore?
Of course, everything is connected.
Everything's
There's also
connected.
there's two concepts in spirituality. There's infinity and there's oneness. Um, and so when you're trying to unify all the chains, that is also a fun oneness concept to dig into. So yes,
Mm,
I'm very fond of like of deep references in branding and these kinds of things. So yeah,
hmm
it's all connected.
Multi-layered.
Yes, yes.
All right, I didn't mean to
Um,
interrupt you.
no, no worries. So what was I talking about? Privacy. Um, so because you just need like yourself and the counterparty that you're like interacting with and like know the state of the thing, you can sort of have like improve privacy guarantees. The thing that I'm still trying to wrap my head around is like how much do you need to reveal the output, right? Like if you're like in a roll up environment, you still post at the end of the day to like the root hash of the roll up to the global consensus, and you're like you're requiring this to be legible in order to be validated. And so like is that also the case with these kinds of mechanisms, or can you layer on top some kind of like zk thing where like our interaction is bundled up inside of a zk proof, and like just the output is what like needs to be posted to the chain, which is that like there's a valid update in like the settlement, but like the core activity itself is not being revealed. That's not something that I've fully wrapped my head around yet. But one thing that I want to like pull as a thread is to look at the difference between like two accounts interacting with each other on chain, versus two AIs that represent us as individuals interacting with each other. And I'm sure this is something that one of the things that you spend some time thinking about is like what is the and certainly one thing that I've been increasingly thinking about is what is the similarities between sort of a global consensus blockchain and like a global master LLM, and who gets to pick what is the order of the transactions that go into the block, or who gets to pick what is the parameter tuning of the global LLM is sort of a similar question, because they're both about reducing information, compressing information, right? Like if you think of like everyone that's interacting with Ethereum, we all have like complex sets of beliefs and desires over what the next state of the chain is, right? But ultimately, there's like a reduction in all that complexity that takes place to say using economics and whatever to like figure out, okay, this is the actual state. And the same thing happens when training an LLM, right? You have all this like really complex data set, and then somehow all of that complex data gets like reduced down into a set of parameter. And I'm probably butchering the language just because I'm not in the AI field, but it does something that's very similar. And like who gets to decide what what information is kept and what information is thrown away, is the same question as who gets to decide which transactions go in, which transactions don't go in. Um, and so in the same way that you'd probably prefer not to have these global systems that generate these global AIs that govern everything. You rather have like individuals that have the ability to train their own AIs based off of the data that they believe in, and then maybe decide which are the other individuals that they like are operating against. There's a question of like, well, how does it then interface with the rest of the world? And so, in the same way that, if you have two accounts transacting with each other, at some point it needs to reveal something to the rest of the world to be able to benefit from global settlement or whatever else. Like the Stephane and Sina AI that's like trained over our mutual preferences, like needs to go out into the world and like interface with the rest of the world at some point as well. And does that then leak all of the preference aggregation that we've done in a way that we lose actually the privacy benefits that we've had from locally training this thing? And that I think is such a key question that I am barely, like, I'm struggling to have the language to express, which is like, can you actually have these isolated pairwise system that exist amongst each other in this richness of information, um, that aren't corruptible by the all-seeing eye of Sauron or global consensus or LLM AI, that can then like influence our pairwise relationship?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. There's another way I've thought about AI and crypto, or LLM foundation models and consensus domains and intents also being parallels, is that um, with you can think of each of these foundation models like OpenAI, ChatGPT, or Anthropic as like its own blockchain, and you have to go and load your data into it, and like basically give it state about yourself. And I noticed that ChatGPT a couple of days ago started, like, I was talking to it and it said, like, I forget, like memory saved or something of that nature. Like it's starting to build up state on who I am. And if you think about it, like the LLM, the more it knows about me, the more personal and private information it has access to, the better it will be at its job. But we're going to live in this world where, as a user, I've given data, my data again resides with them, and I have to kind of give and maintain that with each of these foundation models separately. Whereas alternatively, we could live in a world where the user data stays with me and there's some interface for managing permissions and giving access to these LLM agents on the outside. And then each of them can plug into the state. And I know folks are working on this sort of a thing. So there's a really interesting, and I think intense and like the way we use LLMs have some parallels, in that intents are this kind of like fuzzy way to express preferences, and English, as opposed to, discrete UI elements that we use on a website, like English to an LLM is like an intent-based language, right? We're just like saying a bunch of like fuzzy stuff, and it has to parse it and like figure out what to do with it. So there's a lot of interesting parallels.
That's crazy. Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree. And it's interesting how a lot of it comes back down to permissions, right? Like, how do
Mm-hmm.
I like credibly issue permissions over my state and am able to like protect it? How do I negotiate with counterparties that may have like tremendously more power than me? Um, I think there's kind of like there's so many challenges that emerge with this around like what is even identity, and like what is an individual versus like versus a group. Like, is there even such a thing as the concept of private property, right? Like, if private property is kind of like a made up concept that's like, granted to you by the state, right? And in crypto we've kind of had this challenge of like, do you control or do you own your assets, right? Like, and there's sort of like a difference, right, between the two. You may control something but not own it, and because ownership is sort of a social concept, right? Whereas control, it may be like more about enforcement over like cryptography or something like this. And then if you're being controlled by an AI that's like feeding you like certain types of information, right? Like, then do you even control your private keys? Or like, does this like AI control your private keys through you, right? And then what is the concept of identity? Like, are you an individual in this case, or are you like actually just an extension of the foundation
Mm.
model, and that's like operating on your on through you in some ways? And yeah, all these things get really 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 confusing really fast.
Yeah. Um, Maybe switching gears a bit, I'm curious to talk about just like building, operating, running companies, building institutions, this sphere of things. And I'm very curious. I feel from afar, my sense has been that you're kind of tinkering with different modes of like doing this whole enterprise of like organizing people towards shared goals. And I'm curious, based on everything you've worked on in the past, how do you think about this today? Like how are you building OneBalance as an organization? Do you have any kind of guiding principles in how you're doing that you feel like might be interesting to share?
It's hard, man. That's all I'll say. It's like really hard. It's really hard because um people are people, and people are complex, and they have all sorts of beliefs and needs and desires. And maybe it's like um maybe it's like the experience of a founder, which is um uh, navigating like the internal world as much as like the external world. And one lesson that I've learned actually, and if I was to like give one piece of advice to like any other founder, is like a company is just a mirror, and it's just a mirror of like your own state of being. In much the same way as like other individuals that that one encounters in life are all offering mirrors of oneself. A company is exactly the same thing. And so if as a founder you're doing well, and you're taking care of yourself, and you're thriving, and you're spiritually aligned, and mind, body, spirit, everything's in place, then there's only one way for the company to go, and it will go well. But if those things aren't being taken care of, or being compromised in some way, the company itself will start to show some of these pains as well. So that's been like my like really abstract learning, which is when it feels like there's just infinite amounts of problems to be solved, and there's fires everywhere, like tends to be that the fire is within myself, and like that's the first one to address. And then once that's addressed, then all the other ones seem much easier to take care of.
The do you What does that mean more concretely? Like the fire within to address, like the not feeling like you're good enough, or what is the, to the extent that we want to go down this path, maybe even briefly, but what's that been like in your experience?
Yeah, for me, it's definitely been like some like related to fear. I wouldn't say it's like
Mm,
not feeling good enough, but like some fear of failure. And the question is, at least for me in my journey of exploration, has been like what sits behind that fear. And for me, it was a fear of abandonment, right? And this is like this made up concept that comes from like deep in childhood or whatever, that says like, oh, I'm afraid that if I don't do something well, or like do XYZ thing, then I'm going to have some consequences that are going to make me feel terrible. And I think a lot of people, have these things internalized in one way or another, and it's just part of being human, and it directs how they operate into the world. But it's important to like be able to recognize those things and take care of them, and and be in a position where actions aren't being governed by fear, because as the quote from Dune comes to mind, "Fear is the mind killer,"
my killer.
right?
Yeah.
And
Benny Gesserit know what's up.
that's right. I mean, there's also a lot of really good symbolism in Dune. Like the Golden Path is like an incredibly powerful one. If you're familiar with this one, have you read or watched the movies?
I've read, I still haven't watched the second one.
Okay,
I've read the first two books.
okay. Um, well, sort of in the books, you would have gone to the part where he drinks the the worm, whatever. Um, and then he sort of like sees all the potential futures, right? And then he like finds like the narrow path through all of them. The other movie that has that concept is actually Avengers. I don't know if in like the one of the final Avengers movies, there's like Doctor Strange that like uses his Infinity Stone, and then he analyzes all the potential futures, branches of reality. and then he realizes, oh, this is like the one path to be able to like avoid what's his face, the evil guy from winning. And so there's this concept of like the golden path that emerges in a lot of myths and a lot of narratives. And at least my experience has been that like to see the golden path, you need to eliminate fear, and treat fear sort of at its root. And in the golden path
What
is,
does
how do you get a company to succeed, right?
yeah. What does fear feel like? Is it fear of it's interesting how the fear of failure, I've had a similar journey where I would have, intellectually, if I think about the fear of failure, like, why would I be afraid of failure? It's, I'll just do the best that I can. I'll learn from it. I'll incorporate it into whatever else I'm doing. If at any moment you do the best that you're capable of, then there should technically be no regrets. But in practice, it's like such an emotional thing. And I think in my case, I think it's linked to how I will be perceived as a failure by other people. Like it's like a social phenomenon at the bottom of it. And do you think that just the awareness of that dynamic loosens it, or how have you kind of stepped beyond fear?
I'm curious to learn from you. I mean, I wouldn't by any means say that I'm a master, right? To me, this is finding this alignment and this balance is a question of work, of daily work, right? Um, and there's moments that are easier than others, but I think like fear is just like an emotion that one feels. And emotions come from a place, and most of the time, what I've come to realize is that they actually come from the body. They come from the physical being, and taking care of one's body and one's physical being allows its emotion to sort of still. And then it's about creating room for the emotions to play themselves out. And then usually, once you like take care of all the emotions, then the thinking clarifies. And importantly, I think the thinking is kind of like the last step, right? The mind is this this projection on top of all of the other layers that need to be taken care of. And at least from my experience thus far, the way out of fear is just like take care of the physical being that is a human. Don't overwork, and like uh, relax, have some movement practices, some mindfulness practices, and the accumulation of all these things allow one to be in balance. I think another principle that I've come to realize is it's actually like a full-time job to like be well as a human. Um, and
Being
so
a human is hard.
being a human is really fucking hard. It's a full-time
Yeah.
job. And so anything else that one tries to do in life is essentially a debt, right? That needs to be repaid. And the humanness accumulates the hits of all these other things that we pretend to care about in the world, and that we force ourselves to do.
Hmm.
What are your tricks? How do you deal with fear?
Um, well, one thing that I've sensed is very important, and I've been playing with more intentionally recently, is that having a strong why is actually incredibly powerful. um and that going to like the deepest intentions and aspirations that you have, and connecting with them regularly, is actually like puts everything into context. And I think related to that, I think there's a way in which one can see themselves as being on this grand, like mythological, like archetypal, like storyline. And I feel like the way you are describing things with the golden thread, you called it, um, the golden path. Like I think we are myth oriented. Like we construct our reality through stories, and so that can really just be that can imbue the whole sense of being, and like how you're going about what you're going about what you're doing. Like all of that can be shaped in a really deep way based on how you're holding it. So I feel like that's something I'm playing with, and I find to be pretty exciting.
Have you discovered your why?
Uh, I don't know if I have the. I'm in the process of synthesis. I
Okay.
would say,
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
yeah. There
I
are
think
there are whys, but I sense that there's deeper layers to them. I don't think I've gone to the bottom of the story.
mm, mm,
And
yeah.
and one reason I say that is that I feel like I have multiple whys, and I kind of sense that at bottom there can only maybe be one why. Like there's a power that comes to unifying, like having a single sense of like orientation and directionality.
Um, I ask this question sometimes because I find it's like it's thought provoking and also like surfaces some stuff, which is a question that people don't really ask these days, but I think is really important, which is what are your dreams? Like, what do you dream about for yourself in this life?
Damn man, we're getting deep. There are a few dreams. I definitely have this dream kind of related to meditation and you know touching the depth of what's there with our existence. That's one. It's less of a dream. I think there's a it's a thing that if you choose to hold it at a distance, it will always be at a distance, so you can kind of like bring it into this moment. um the other dream that I think ties into everything we're working on is that I kind of feel like we're on this grand arc, this like grand arc of humanity. And like, where does this story end? And that we're capable, like all the crazy things we've done together, and through all of our kind of muddling along and all the, all the dead ends and all the difficulties that each of us have, like it's pretty freaking incredible the world that we've built, and that the kind of script isn't pre-written, and that it's literally us. It's like people like me and you who are defining what happens next, and like moving the world in that direction. And that's just like a great mystery, and incredibly exciting.
Uh-huh. So the great unfolding, just being party to the great unfolding of reality.
Yeah, you could say that.
I think um why I'm curious, how does this relate to your dream? Like, do you have a role that you want to play in that in that unfolding of the story of humanity? Is it an observer role? Is it a player role?
Oh, it's a player role, 100%. Yeah, definitely. uh Gotta be in the arena.
Of course. The way that I think about it is, and you opened up our conversation by talking about communing with infinity. Um, so maybe you can link it back to this, right? Um, to me, that is communing with infinity, is like leaving my mark on the world. I sort of have this belief that all of reality is just like one great wave function. And as far as I mean, you know better than me with the physics, but as far as I understand, the physics work out that like all of reality is just one big wave function, and that wave we don't really know where it comes from, but this energy wave is kind of like pervasive everywhere. And everything that I do, I feel like sort of touches on this wave in one way or another. And so when I picture it in like my mind's eye, I sort of feel like the wave is coming through me and like coming out of me, and like it's coming from infinity and it's like going towards infinity. And the greater I can like play with this wave, and the more I get to like interact with it, the more I sort of feel connected. Feel connected to other humans, feel connected to like reality, feel connected to some kind of purpose in my life. And so, yeah, maybe I would offer that as at least my view of how I feel like I'm a player inside of the game that is reality. I feel it's like connecting with this great wave of of energy that surrounds all around us, and leaving some form of a mark of my own consciousness on it.
Mm. What a place to end on. Maybe bringing it to a slightly more lighthearted note, but related, is I think you wrote this tweet of, if you could design a college degree for someone working in crypto, what would it be? And your answer was operations research, computer science, game theory, antitrust, sociology, and religious studies. And why is religious studies in there?
Um, Really, I just like listed the topics that like I was interested in college. So it was a little bit self-serving of an answer.
Yeah.
Um, I think religious studies is fascinating because it's just another like tool for getting humans to coordinate with each other towards certain outcomes. And I have a very coarse um, description of what like blockchains are, which are just groups of humans coming to agreements with other humans, and religion is kind of like an OG operating model for how do you get humans to coordinate with each other beyond the infamous Dunbar number, and so um, much like blockchains are about human coordination, religions also were. I think studying cults is actually like incredibly interesting as well, and it's like it's a fun hobby if you haven't explored it. But people derive meaning in their lives in all kinds of diverse ways, and what I find the most interesting isn't necessarily the particularities and the differences between like different cults or sets of beliefs, but it's the unifying principles that exist across all of them. And there's just so much beauty to be found in um, how people across different like completely different backgrounds still organize around similar beliefs and principles. So so yeah, I mean, we're all just groups of humans trying to be humans, and so
Hmm.
there's so much that can be learned from looking at previous methods of doing that.
Hmm. Okay, that's a great place to end on. Thanks so much for taking the time. This was really
Yeah,
fun.
thank you so much. I mean, yeah,
To be continued.
it's great to be able to go as abstract as we want without any any
We
consequences.
went from the most concrete to the most abstract in one conversation.
I enjoyed it a lot. It was great to catch up.
Hey, I'm going to make a small ask here. If you've been listening to these conversations and want to support what we're doing here, I would really appreciate if you could leave a rating and a review for the podcast wherever you're listening to it. This might seem like a small thing, but it will really help other people also discover the show. Thank you. I'm grateful to be able to do this and look forward to being here together again soon.